Hey, I'm Andrew, and I'm a kids leader at God First Parks. Thanks for taking time to hang out with us in your busy week. I don't know about you, but I found the lockdown period to be incredibly stressful for my family and I. Between the pressures of work and family and the threat of this pandemic hanging over our shoulders, I've really been thinking a lot about where my priorities should lie. And it reminded me of a quote I read on Kerrin Williams' blog, The Dad Dude. By the way, this is a fantastic resource for anyone who has anything to do with kids. The quote is taken from Rob Parsons' book, The 60-Minute Family, and he says this: "We read or hear about those people who seem to squeeze it all in. A high-powered career, sitting on the board of an NPO, read stories to their kids each night, and bake cakes that would make Jamie Oliver salivate. But the truth is that we can't squeeze it all in. Every choice of time we make precludes another choice we might have made. The idea that you can have it all and do it all is a myth. Supermom and Superdad doesn't exist. You can wear your undies on the outside, but you still can't fly. And yet we try, don't we? I know I do. Well, not the underwear thing, of course. And as a follower of Jesus, I find it incredibly hard to carve out time to spend with God, let alone to spend time helping my kids develop their own faith and build a relationship with God of their own. We feel torn in a multitude of directions, and often, even in religious systems, people are placed under more and more pressure to give more, to pray more, to evangelize more, to read more, to do more, and to fail less. I feel terribly underqualified to give any advice on parenting or kids' ministry leadership. But what I can share are some of the practices and stories that are helping to shape me and are showing me that ordinary, normal people like you and me can find God in our ordinary lives. Not by adding more to our schedules, but by opening our eyes to the reality that God is already present. So, some poetry, because I know that in your hectic daily schedules, you all make time to read stuff written in the 1800s. This is an excerpt from a 9-book-long epic poem, Aurora Lee, by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and it was written in 1856. And no, I haven't read all 9 books, only one page, to be honest. Earth's crammed with heaven, and every bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries, and daub their faces unaware." Now, if you didn't understand the bush and the shoe thing, this is a poem that's referencing the story of Moses as he comes across a bush on fire in the middle of the desert. And the bush itself is not being burnt up in the process. And as his curiosity gets the best of him, he moves in closer for a better look, but is stopped in his tracks by a voice coming from the bush itself, telling him to take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. Holy ground in the middle of nowhere. I love this poem, not only because it references one of my favorite characters and stories in the Bible, but because it dumbfounds me that 160 odd years later, humanity is still struggling to find the holy in the ordinary. We live these dualistic lives where we separate out the material from the spiritual. We limit God to our quiet times and our Sunday gatherings. And in the process, we become blind to the presence of God in the everyday, in the ordinary bush. Jacob had a similar experience, wandering in the desert and finding God in an unexpected place. Genesis 28:16 records that when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was unaware of it." So the question is every ordinary bush really afire with God? Perhaps not. Maybe sometimes a bush is just a bush. But no bush is absent from his presence. As David writes, "If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." I don't want to miss the burning bushes in ordinary life. I don't want to look back and say, God was in this place and I was unaware of it. So where does one begin? So many of the authors I've been reading are realizing that as Christians and churches, we need to stop centering our communities around a system of belief and rediscover our faith as a way of life. as a practice. The early church developed a number of spiritual practices to help their communities know and see God better. And in our modern, super sophisticated 21st century lives, I think many of us have tossed these out the window, or probably aren't even aware of them. Because who needs them? I am saved, I read my Bible, well, now and again, and I pray. I have it waxed. But I really think that there's a ton that we can learn from these practices to help us in our daily lives. Spiritual practices are about developing character, about realizing that who we are is far more important than all the stuff we accumulate. And as parents, who doesn't want their kids to develop godly character? But these practices are about far more than this. They're about aliveness and awareness, about waking up and discovering life, about becoming more human, and about teaching ourselves to become the types of people that have eyes that actually see and ears that actually hear, and so experience more and more regularly, not just survival, but life in all of its fullness. That's what happened to Moses and to Jacob and to anyone else who has eyes to see and takes off their shoes. I remember as a kid traveling on long-distance holidays, and with my cassette tape Walkman in my ears, I would stick my head out of the window and feel the rush of the wind through my hair and hand surf behind the side mirror. As Brian McLaren explains, this is what it's like to be alive to God's Spirit, to tune our radios to the frequency of the holy and to dare to sing along. There are so many practices that are of value to us 21st century creatures, but I want to share one with you that I believe can help us to help our kids find the sacred in everyday life. It's the practice of photosis, a strange Greek word that you need not remember, but it's the practice of learning to see clearly all things in the light of God. Light is an interesting thing. Yes, we can see light, waves of electromagnetic radiation that the human eye is amazingly able to detect. But more typically, light is something by which we see everything else. And it's the same way with God. When we let the light of God into our lives, into our beings, we start to see clearly all things in His light. Jesus said that the eye is the lamp of our body. If our eyes are good, our lives will be full of light. But if our eyes are bad, they will be filled with terrible darkness. Our vision of so many things is distorted, beginning with God. Some people don't see God at all, but others are even worse off because the God that they see, and I'm talking about the Christian God here, is a monster or emotionally distant, disinterested, unreliable, or even abusive. Likewise, we don't see ourselves or others correctly either. Imagine what our world would look like if we saw each other through God's eyes. What else don't we see clearly? Money, time, stuff, pain and sickness and failure, the natural world around us. So how do we let this light in? Well, an obvious practice is to study the Bible. This is extremely important in knowing and seeing clearly who God is. But our minds are more than just our intellect. And as for our kids especially, who don't have the ability to read yet, well, many of them, we really need to find other ways to engage with God. We also have our imaginations and our intuitions, something our kids are far more in tune with. And so we take in light through all these other means too. I came across this Catholic nun by the name of Dr. Elizabeth Julian, and she had this thought that maybe instead of practicing our faith, we should start faithing our practices. Instead of practicing our faith, we should start faithing our practices. Look at some of the practices that are meaningful to you. Exercising, cooking, reading, knitting, CrossFit, and maybe some of the ones that you don't enjoy so much, like traffic or hanging up the washing. And imbue these practices with meaning derived from your faith. Look for traces of the divine, God's greatness, His provision, His strength and His generosity, and allow His joy, His peace, and His grace to fill you and lead you as you continue into your day. Your day is going to look very different to mine, and you're going to have to find ways of seeing God and seeing everything else in the practices that you engage in and the places you inhabit. But there are some parts of our day which I think we're going to have in common. And I'd like to share some of these practices that I've developed with my family, or that we've come across in friendship circles, or we've read in books. The first is the practice of sharing tables. One of the first things my wife and I did when we got married was to buy an antique table for our kitchen. Countless years and meals later, shared with family and friends, that table has come to represent God's goodness and His grace in our lives. Barry Jones writes of a similar experience. At the table, meals were shared, stories were told, sins were confessed. We laughed together and cried together. Together we remembered where we'd been, and we dreamed of where we might one day go. We prayed at that table, and there we experienced God's nearness, God's kindness, and God's love. Tables are one of the most important places of human connection. In fact, they're one of the most uniquely human things that we do. No other animal eats at a table. And food has this way of bringing us together and reminding us of our connection to the earth and to one another. God has this way of rocking up at tables in the Bible. And Jesus, in His parables and in His actual life, the table becomes a symbol for His grace and His acceptance of all. As Jones continues to say, in this fast-paced, tech-saturated, attention-deficit disordered life and culture in which we find ourselves, Christians need to recover the art of a slow meal around a table with people we care about. At the table, we are equals, and we get to look each other in the eye, something very few of us still do. I remember when we were looking for feeding chairs for our baby girls, we intentionally sought out chairs that didn't have a small table of their own in front, because we wanted the chair to be able to be pushed up against the family table. We wanted our girls to grow up knowing that this was a shared and sacred space. A space where after a long and crazy day, we prioritized spending time with one another and sharing our gratefulness for God's constant provision in our lives. When friends or family come for dinner, our girls hardly ever sit at a table of their own. We want them to know that they are seen and heard, not only by their parents, but by other adults too. But our table practices are not limited to the table itself. We have this tradition of making pancakes, flapjacks, or French toast every Saturday morning. And everyone gets their hands dirty, and it normally involves loud music and crazy dance moves. It's a full body experience that engages all the senses. And no matter the breakdowns or the fights or the tears that happened the day before or even the half hour before, that space remains happy and safe. And it gives us hope that if we can find a small piece of heaven in the simple act of throwing a piece of bread in a bowl of whisked eggs, maybe we can get it right in the day ahead, or in the week ahead, or in our circles of friends at school and at work. I picked up another practice in a book by Tracy Smith called Faithful Families. It's the practice of Gratitude Cafe. Carving out quiet time is hard. Finding a place to do this when your kids are awake an hour before you and are tearing around the house, creating a raucous, is almost impossible. And it would seem obvious that inviting them to join you may be the answer. But in practice, how would we even get them to sit still? Well, the idea with Gratitude Cafe is to find a regular time to meet as a family, to share our thankfulness for what's going on in our lives. Tracy suggests getting up early, maybe once a week, making a special drink for each person, maybe with a sprinkle of marshmallows, and gathering for about 10 to 15 minutes max. Parents lead by reminding everyone of how much we have to be grateful for, from the air we breathe, to the homes we live in, to our circle of friends. And then everyone grabs a piece of paper and either draws or writes down 5 things for which they are grateful for, before sharing it with the whole family. Now, this should not be a boring practice. It should involve cookies, colored paper, paint, googly eyes, pom-poms, whatever you can get your hands on. It needs to engage the senses and it needs to be fun, or it's not going to work for our kids. We recently did an activity with our preteens at church where we explored the attributes of God. We had them engage with heavy rocks, a glass of water, food, a warm jacket, a shield, a crown, and a host of other objects, all of which are used in the Bible as metaphors to describe God. They got to engage and experience God with all of their senses, and then respond and express how it made them feel about God through art, journaling, prayer, and silence. The kids loved it. And what these things really show the kids is that God is dynamic and that He's able to meet them in their unique space and needs. When I first came across the term soaking prayer, it sounded very spacey, but it's simply resting in God's presence and His love, rather than actively talking in prayer. It's about waiting patiently for God to speak to us through our thoughts and our imaginations. We love doing this with our kids in our church gatherings, playing soft music, reading a short passage from the Bible, and then followed by some prompts or some questions for the kids to dwell on. Now, you may say that this is typically not something you do in your everyday, and I would agree with you. But I mention it because we model to our kids that life is about running from one thing to the next, about never stopping to take a breath, because we all must live with FOMO, and life is really, really short. Maybe our everyday lives could do with a little bit of slowing down, with a little bit of waiting instead of working. Jared Patrick Boyd has this incredible book, Imaginative Prayer. It's a series of guided prayers that help kids to connect with God through the use of their imaginations. My kids have loved them, and we've even done some of our own. And what I love the most about these prayers is that they don't tell kids what to believe, but allow them to experience God and His love and His grace, and then respond in their own way. Maybe you adapt this to include stargazing, or sitting around a bonfire roasting marshmallows and watching the sparks float up into the darkness. Either way, these are spaces to be quiet together, to search the darkness for the light, literally, and maybe to have real unforced conversations with our kids about things that really matter to them. We've even made our own God glasses, which I'm going to show you now, these babies. But in our modern times, you could use your COVID mask, as Cyril has shown us how to do. Either way, these devices help our kids to see that seeing often involves closing our eyes so that we're not distracted by stuff around us and we can see God more clearly right in front of us. Kerrin Williams, the dad dude, has this family tradition called 5 Alive, where a few times a week at 5 o'clock they mess around in the garden, or they skate and bike in the road, or they go for a walk in the nearby park. It's a family time centered around play. And in play, we get to engage our whole bodies in the act of seeking out joy. I recently listened to this TED Talk by Lee on the subject of joy. Joy, she explains, is the intense momentary experience of positive emotion, one that makes us smile and laugh and want to jump up and down. It's different from happiness, which measures how good we feel over time. Joy is about feeling good in the moment. She asks the question, where does joy come from? And what she found is that the things that bring us joy cut across lines of age, gender, and ethnicity. Bright colors, round shapes, symmetry, abundance. And we perceive these things through our senses. They're about aesthetics, which in the original Greek form means I feel, I sense, I perceive. Joy is about having eyes that see and ears that hear and experiencing life in its fullness right here, right now. I want my kids to learn that eternal life is not about escaping this world to a one life better elsewhere, but it's about finding life on this planet in relationship with God and with our neighbor and all of nature, and investing all of our being right here, right now, and into eternity. What brings my family a lot of joy is board games. Me, not so much, but I'm getting there. And this whole COVID lockdown has been an incredible opportunity to really get into them. No grown man should have to have played as much Uno as I have over the last while, but my kids just can't get enough of it. And one thing we've recently discovered is cooperative games, where everyone works in one team to play against the board. We got this really cool game called Outfoxed, where as a team you have to solve a crime committed by the fox. And what I love about these types of games is that they're so countercultural. We live in a world that tells our kids that everything is about a competition, about being better than everyone else. Oh, sorry. But God isn't playing that game. All this point earning and scorekeeping, all the ways that we make a case for how good or how worthy we are, God's not interested in that, because we've been fully accepted and loved from the very beginning. I want my kids to know this, not only when they go to church on a Sunday or when we do bedtime prayers, but in the way they engage with others. And games like this are a great way to talk to our kids about joining hands, especially with those that we are told are other or different. Find what brings your family joy and help your kids to see and hear in a world where everyone walks around with headphones on their ears and eyes glued to a screen. I've talked about the practice of photosis, about allowing God's light into our lives and helping us to see everything else differently. But seeing is not the end goal. It's part of the journey. And it leads us to another practice, the practice of theosis, the practice of joining God in the light. Think of a piece of metal in a fire. The longer you leave it in the flames, the more it begins to glow. We started with the story of Moses and the burning bush. The beginning of his story, really, a story that would lead him back to the same mountain many years later. And this time, he goes to the top of the mountain to meet with God. And when he returns down, he's described as radiating light from his face, so much so that they threw a cloth over his head. This is what happens when we place ourselves in God's light. We become overpowered by the nature of God, and we begin to glow with God's radiance. We join God in being the light. I want this for my kids. I want them to join God in joy and in love, in action and in suffering. I've mentioned it before, but I want to emphasize it again. The point of so many of these spiritual practices is not to add more to our schedules, but to help us to find God in the ordinary of the everyday. My hope is that you don't take some of these ideas and squeeze them into time and space that doesn't exist, but rather that you open your eyes to the God who is already present in everything that you and your family are already doing. And that you help your kids to see this too, so that they don't reach adulthood and say, God was in this place, and I wasn't aware of it. And so, with the words of Carrie Job and the authors of the Bible, I join with thousands before me in a practice of speaking blessings over those you love. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he turn his face towards you and bring you peace. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, your family and your children, and their children and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you, besides you, all around you and within you. He is with you. He is with you. In the morning and the evening, in your coming and your going, in your weeping and rejoicing. He is for you. He is for you. Amen.